The satanic monk. The wind howled through the crumbling ruins of St. Agatha's Monastery, a place long abandoned and shrouded in tales of unspeakable evil. Perched atop a jagged cliff overlooking the restless sea, the monastery was a shadow of its former self. Ivy and moss clawed at the stone walls, and the once magnificent stained glass windows now stood as fractured memories of faith. Locals whispered about strange lights seen in the ruins at night, and the echoes of guttural chants carried on the wind. But few dared to venture near. Simon Barrett, a journalist with a penchant for the macabre, decided to investigate. Known for uncovering grim truths, Simon had made a career out of chasing dark legends and hidden horrors. This time he was drawn to the tale of Brother Ezekiel, a monk-turned-heretic who had supposedly forged a pact with the devil himself. According to legend, Brother Ezekiel had been a man of deep faith, but years of plague and famine had driven him to despair. Convinced that God had abandoned humanity, Ezekiel sought forbidden knowledge in ancient texts locked away in the monastery's crypt. What he found changed him forever. They said he had performed a dark ritual, sacrificing his brothers in a blood-soaked ceremony to summon infernal powers. When the townsfolk stormed the monastery to stop him, they found only corpses and a blackened altar. Ezekiel was never seen again, but his presence lingered, a shadow that tainted the land. Simon was determined to separate fact from fiction. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook, he made his way to the ruins as dusk bled into night. The air grew colder as Simon approached the monastery, the dense forest surrounding it like a natural barrier. Twisted branches clawed at him as he pushed through the undergrowth. By the time he reached the entrance, the last traces of daylight had vanished. The heavy wooden doors were ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Simon stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The interior was eerily silent. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around him. Simon took a deep breath and began his exploration. He found the remnants of the dining hall, the kitchen, and the monks' quarters, all in various states of ruin. But it was a chapel that stopped him in his tracks. The altar stood at the center, its surface stained with something dark and viscous that had seeped into the stone over centuries. Symbols were etched into the walls, their jagged lines forming patterns that made Simon's head throb the longer he looked at them. He snapped a few photos, his hands trembling. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Simon froze, straining to catch the sound. It seemed to come from below, an almost imperceptible murmur that beckoned him deeper into the ruins. He followed it, his flashlight revealing a narrow staircase hidden behind a rotting tapestry. The stairs spiraled downward, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispering grew louder, resolving into words spoken in a language Simon didn't recognize. He reached the bottom and found himself in a crypt. Rows of sarcophagi lined the walls, their lids carved with the likenesses of long-dead monks. At the far end of the room was a massive stone door, its surface covered in the same arcane symbols he'd seen in the chapel. As Simon approached, he felt a vibration in the air, as if the door itself was alive. His curiosity overpowered his fear. He pushed against the heavy door, and it groaned open, revealing a chamber bathed in an unnatural red glow. The source of the light was a massive pentagram etched into the floor, its grooves filled with a substance that looked disturbingly fresh. In the center of the pentagram stood a figure. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His robes were tattered, their crimson hue matching the glow of the pentagram. His skin was pallid, stretched tight over angular bones, and his eyes burned with an otherworldly fire. This was Brother Ezekiel. You should not have come. Ezekiel's voice was a guttural rasp, layered with an inhuman timbre. Simon's knees threatened to give way, but he forced himself to stand his ground. Are you Ezekiel? He managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Ezekiel tilted his head, a grotesque smile spreading across his face. I am what remains of him, and soon you will join me. The pentagram flared brighter, and the ground trembled. Shadows spilled from the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. Simon stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering as the temperature plummeted. He turned to run, but the crypt door slammed shut with a deafening crash. Simon's mind raced. He had to get out. He ducked behind a sarcophagus, trying to steady his breathing. The shadows crept closer, their shapes shifting into nightmarish forms. Simon could hear Ezekiel chanting, his voice resonating with a power that made Simon's teeth ache. Desperate, Simon pulled a crucifix from his pocket, a relic he'd brought more out of superstition than faith. As he held it up, the shadows recoiled, hissing like wounded animals. Ezekiel's chanting faltered, and he turned his fiery gaze towards Simon. "Stop! Faith will not save you here," Ezekiel snarled. He raised his hands, and the shadows surged forward. Simon cried out as they enveloped him, their icy touch draining his strength. He swung the crucifix wildly, and the shadows dissipated just enough for him to break free. Simon spotted a rusted iron lever near the wall, half buried in rubble. With the last of his strength, he lunged for it and pulled. The chamber shook violently as the pentagram cracked and the red glow dimmed. Ezekiel screamed, a sound that was more beast than man, as the symbols on his flesh burned with searing light. The chamber began to collapse. Simon scrambled to his feet, dodging falling debris as he made his way back to the stairs. Behind him, Ezekiel's screams echoed, mingling with the roar of the collapsing crypt. He reached the staircase and climbed as fast as his legs would allow, the walls shaking around him. When he emerged into the night, the monastery was ablaze. Flames lit the sky and the air was filled with the acrid stench of burning stone. Simon stumbled away, collapsing on the forest floor as the ruins crumbled into the earth. Weeks later, Simon sat in his apartment, poring over the footage he'd managed to capture. The images were grainy, but the horrors he'd witnessed were unmistakable. He'd sent copies to several experts, hoping for answers, but none could explain what he'd encountered. One night, as he reviewed the footage for the 100th time, his phone buzzed. It was an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "You cannot escape him." Simon hesitated before opening it. The email contained a single image, a photo of his apartment building, taken from the street below. His blood ran cold as he realized the photo had been taken that night. He rushed to the window and peered outside, but the street was empty. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, rising from the shadows of his room. Simon turned, and the last thing he saw were eyes burning with an unholy fire. Ezekiel had found him. Simon's disappearance made headlines, but no trace of him was ever found. The footage he'd recorded surfaced online, fueling endless speculation. Some dismissed it as a hoax, while others claimed it was evidence of a reality too terrifying to comprehend. But those who watched the footage reported strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, shadows that moved on their own, and a chilling sense that they were not alone. The legend of Brother Ezekiel lived on, and his curse continued to claim new victims. The ruins of St. Agatha's monastery remained silent, but the shadow of its dark history grew ever darker, waiting for the next unwary soul to stumble into its grasp.